We begin tonight with the president taking an unequivocal and impassioned stand.
I will do everything that I can, as long as I'm President of the United States, to remind the American people that we are one nation under God. And we may call that God different names, but we remain one nation. We are not at war against Islam. We're at war against terrorist organizations that have distorted Islam or falsely used the banner of Islam to engage in their destructive acts. And we've got to be clear about that. We've got to be clear about that because if we're going to successfully reduce the terrorist threat, then we need all the allies we can get. The folks who are most interested in a war between the United States or the West and Islam are Al-Qaeda. That's what they've been banking on. We want to be clear about who the enemy is here. It's a handful, a tiny minority of people who are engaging in horrific acts and have killed Muslims more than anybody else. The other reason it's important for us to remember that is because we've got millions of Muslim Americans, our fellow citizens in this country. They're going to school with our kids. They're our neighbors. They're our friends. They're our co-workers. And, when we start acting as if their religion is somehow offensive, what are we saying to them? I've got Muslims who are fighting in Afghanistan in the uniform of the United States Armed Services. They're out there putting their lives on the line for us. And we've got to make sure that we are crystal clear for our sakes and their sakes. They are America's. And we honor their service. And part of honoring their service is making sure that they understand that we don't differentiate between them and us. It's just us. And that is a principle that I think is going to be very important for us to sustain. And I think tomorrow is an excellent time for us to reflect on that. Thank you very much, everybody.
Today was the president's first press conference since May, and it ended on that rather impassioned, rather pugnacious note. If some of that rhetoric sounds familiar, it may be in part because you've heard that sentiment before. From President Obama, sure, but you have also heard it from previous presidents. Most notably, you have heard similar sentiments from President Bush just after the attacks of 9/11.
These acts of violence against innocents violate the fundamental tenets of the Islamic faith. And it's important for my fellow Americans to understand that. The enemy of America is not our many Muslim friends. It is not our many Arab friends. Americans understand we fight not a religion. Ours is not a campaign against the Muslim faith. Our war is against evil, not against Islam. There are thousands of Muslims who proudly call themselves Americans. And they know what I know, that the Muslim faith is based upon peace and love and compassion. The exact opposite of the teachings of the Al-Qaeda organization, which is based upon evil and hate and destruction.
Strong parallels there between the words of President George W. Bush post 9/11 and the words of President Barack Obama in the first presidential administration after Bush's. But here's what's different right now about hearing our president now make essentially that same case that President Bush made after 9/11. Now, when you say, hey, we're not actually at war with Islam, Now when you say that, it's not just a rhetorical point. Those statements now don't begin with an implied, we can all agree that. It's no longer everybody knows that we're not at war with Islam. It's not that way anymore, because now there is a significant part of the mainstream conservative movement in this country that contests that point. That says, no, 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 we are at war with Islam. We are. Saying we're not at war with Islam used to be a rhetorical flourish, almost a platitude. It is officially no longer a platitude, because the context now for this president making that point about the country not being at war with Islam, the context for that now is a chorus of people on the right saying, oh yeah, we are.
We should not allow Muslims to serve in the U.S. military, and we have got to raise questions about whether we can afford to allow Muslims to immigrate into the United States at all.
That's a man named Brian Fisher, a relatively fringe extremist American pastor, emboldened by his own fantasies about holy war and how important they make him feel. Who cares about a guy like Brian Fisher of the American Family Association? I mean, we have kooks galore in this country. Why care about him? The reason we care about him and his "oh please, let's have a holy war" tripe is because Brian Fisher is also a man who will be sharing a stage. As Justin Elliott at Salon.com reports today, he will be sharing a stage with lots and lots and lots of mainstream conservatives next week. He is a featured speaker at something called the Values Voter Summit, along with Mitt Romney, Mike Huckabee, Sean Hannity, Newt Gingrich, Senator Jim DeMint, Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, Virginia's Governor Bob McDonnell. Guess he's over that whole, hey, now I'm a moderate thing. Also presidential hopeful Mike Pence. All of those folks, all those relatively mainstream conservative folks, speaking alongside a guy who not only says we are at war with Islam, but Muslims should not be allowed to serve in the United States military. If you are a Muslim and you want to move to this country, that should preclude you from being able to do so. Now, of course, a man like Brian Fisher is entitled to his own kook opinions. But at some point, is there any political accountability for people who are mainstreaming him by appearing with him at a political event? People who are running for president in 2012, in all likelihood, are appearing alongside the "no more Muslims in America" guy. There ought to be a religious test, and if you are Muslim, you ought to not be allowed to serve in the U.S. military guy. Are there any political consequences for mainstreaming and appearing alongside a guy doing that? When President Obama gets up and says we are not at war with Islam, of course we are not at war with Islam. But that does not mean that there are not a whole lot of people in the mainstream of the right. Mainstream of the right wing in this country who are trying to create the impression that we are. As we talked about on this show last night, Newt Gingrich has put together a hokey 9/11 exploitation movie to argue and convince us all that we are at war with Islam.
And many of our elites are afraid to even identify our adversaries by name.
What we used to call the war on terror, we are clearly losing.
This war will go on until the whole of the world either embraces Islam or submits to Islamic rule.
Newt Gingrich choosing the anniversary of 9/11 this year to launch his "It's a War on Islam" movie. But he's not the only one in the "It's a War on Islam" caucus. You may recall our earlier reporting on members of Congress this year convincing themselves that they had uncovered a vast Islamic conspiracy on the part of the Council on American Islamic Relations. The conspiracy was that this mainstream Washington pressure group was allowing Muslims, actual Muslims, to be interns.
About a year ago, I learned that CARE was trying to infiltrate the offices of members of Congress by placing interns in the offices.
Planting spies in key national security-related congressional offices.
It is unnerving, to say the least, that there would be members of groups catalyzed by CARE coming into congressional offices to try to change our public policy.
Yes, that was a real thing that really happened. 3 actual members of Congress, Congresswoman Sue Myrick, Congressman Paul Brown, Congressman Trent Franks. A group of people who are actual members of the United States Congress publicly demanding that the House Sergeant at Arms investigate the crime of being an intern while also being a Muslim. It sounds like all-American rhetoric when a president, any president, makes the case that Muslim Americans are Americans too, that we are at war with terrorists. We're not at war with Islam. That religious freedom wasn't just a founding principle of this country. It is a living principle of this country. It sounds like Americana, political rhetoric. But at some point, the politics surrounding this issue are probably going to have to change to reflect the fact that what President Obama is saying about religion now, the same thing President Bush said about religion after 9/11, is no longer a consensus statement of what we all believe in America, or even of what we all in mainstream politics believe here in America. There is a hard, focused campaign on the relatively mainstream right in this country to make those self-evident truths seem false. Joining us now is Gene Robinson, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post and MSNBC political analyst. Gene, thanks very much for being here.
Great to be here, Rachel.
So the president is impassioned today on this issue of separating terrorism from religion. But is there something missing here? It isn't a faceless horde pushing this idea that those things aren't separate, that there really is a war on Islam. It's specific, knowable people.
Well, yes, the specific, people who we know. And look, I wonder, Rachel, how much of this has been kind of out there under the surface all along. And I wonder if now perhaps it is somehow permissible to say these things rather than just kind of think them or keep them bottled up inside. So I guess I wonder if there was a day when the rhetoric of George Bush and the rhetoric of Barack Obama was just, this is something we all believe. Maybe we didn't all believe it as a nation, and that's a disturbing thought, but something we have to consider.
I wonder if because there is an identifiable, relatively mainstream group on the right, people like Gingrich, for example, pushing this line now openly, not just hinting at prejudice, but really trying to make this a mainstream point in conservative America. I wonder if there is some percentage, some political percentage in naming the people who are pushing this idea. I guess it's the same decision the president had to make about the people who were saying he didn't have a birth certificate or he was secretly Muslim. Do you just describe that as a rumor that exists in the ether and address it that way, or do you name and shame the people who say it?
Well, I think if I'm right and there is more of this we're at war against Islam sentiment out there than perhaps we realize, I think you probably have to attack it, frontally and massively and talk about the phenomenon and talk about the people. I mean, I've been thinking about this, obviously, but I think there are like three, at least, strains of this sort of sentiment. There's kind of a visceral, paranoid, they attacked us, it's us versus them, as if Islam was some sort of, supranation as opposed to a faith, and they're the enemy. There are the religious fundamentalists who have the theological dispute with Islam, and who, for some of whom that leads them to say, therefore Islam is the devil. And then there's the ideological, pseudo-intellectual kind of clash of civilizations idea. And I would put someone like Newt Gingrich in that category, because he has talked about this sort of idea that there's something special, unique about Anglo-American culture and heritage, and I suppose you'd have to call it Anglo-American Judeo-Christian, and that it is under threat from these other cultures and civilizations around the world, and we're being threatened by Islam, and so he really does see it as, if not a holy war, then certainly a civilizational war. And I think those are kind of different people and different impulses that lead, I'm afraid, a substantial number of people to roughly the same place.
And taking it on in a frontal way, as you say, may require a lot of different types of arguments in order to address those different strains of this prejudice. Gene Robinson, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post and MSNBC political analyst, thank you for joining us tonight, Gene.
Great to be here, Rachel.